Hi everyone! Today I'm showing you how I made this rib stitch blanket using loop yarn. I wanted a blanket that's thick and reversible, so I came up with this pattern. It's a bit small at 26 by 54 inches, but you can make yours whatever size you want. The free pattern is in the description below. During this tutorial, we will, number 1, do several rows of the rib stitch, number 2, change colors and add new yarn, and number 3, make nice edges at the top and bottom. For the supplies, you'll need 2 balls of light gray loop yarn, 1 ball of lavender loop yarn, 2 balls of dark purple loop yarn, and also scissors, a yarn needle, and a clothespin or something else to clip onto your yarn. So let's begin. We need to reserve some yarn to smoothen out our bottom edge later. So cut open 2 loops so you have a tail. Now since this blanket is 41 stitches wide, we need to reserve 41 loops. So count out 41 loops and mark the 41st loop with a clothespin or something so that you don't work it by accident. So now for row 1. Making row 1 is easy. Just count out 41 project loops. I'm just wrapping some yellow yarn around the project loops of row 1 so you don't mix them up with the working loops. We're ready to start row 2. In my left hand, I have loop 41, and in my right, I have my first working loop. Put the working loop behind loop 41 and push it through back to front. That's a knit stitch, and it's the first stitch of row 2. Now let's find our next project loop. So there's the project loop of row 1, and that's the working loop. So you're going to put that working loop in front of your project loop, and this time you're pushing it through front to back. So that's the purl stitch. You're going to pull that upwards to help keep things nice and tidy. For the third stitch, let's find your next project loop. Okay, so there it is. And now let's find your next working loop. Okay, there's your working loop. You'll knit the stitch so the working loop pushes through back to front. So you'll pull the loops upwards to stay organized. Now let's find our next project loop. There it is. And the working loop. Okay, there it is, and you're making sure it's not twisted. You'll put that working loop in front, and you're going to push it through front to back. And that's your purl stitch. At this point, now that you've done knit, purl, you can work on your own and alternate between these knit stitches and purl stitches until the end of the row. The beginning is always messy, but it will soon get organized as you see in this picture. So just make sure your loops don't get twisted, and we'll do the transition from row 2 to row 3 together. See you soon. So I have finished row 2, and you can see that the last 3 stitches are knit, purl, knit. You can see that I've reached the loop where I've clipped off because I'm saving that yarn for later. And that's my working loop for row 3. I'm knitting it, so I'm pushing it through back to front. So my next loop on my working yarn needs to get purled. So I need to put that in front. And I'm going to be pushing it through front to back. And that's my purl stitch. Keep going in the same fashion until you've done 9 light gray rows in total. Your last stitch will be on the right. Then we'll meet to change from light gray to lavender. So now we're changing colors. Let's find the last knit stitch and the next working loop, which will be for the tail. We'll cut off anything else. Then we're going to cut open that working loop and we're going to tuck that tail in between the loops. Now, as for the lavender yarn, we're going to cut one loop open for the tail, and we're going to place that on top of the gray tail. Then, as usual, we're going to knit the first stitch, but this time with a lavender loop. And then, as usual, we're going to purl. So as you knit and purl, you'll be securing those two tails inside your blanket, and this will save you from having to weave them in later. So knit 3 rows of lavender on your own, and then move on to dark purple. You'll change colors in the same way by creating tails that are tucked into the blanket as you knit and purl above them. To go back to the pattern, we have finished 9 rows of gray, and we're working on 3 rows of lavender, and we'll move on to do 38 rows of dark purple, or whatever 2 balls of yarn give you, then 3 rows of lavender, and finally 9 rows of gray. So knit on your own, and we'll meet when you're at the top of the blanket, which is after you finish the last row of gray. Then we'll bind off together. Since the leftover yarn is on the left, we absolutely need to start binding off from the right. So we'll take the last pair of loops in the corner and we'll put the left one into the right one and pull it upwards pretty tight. You'll keep inserting the left loop into the loop that you just worked, and you'll keep pulling it pretty tight upwards. And that's because this will help keep the different columns evenly spaced. Keep binding off by putting the loop towards the left through the loop you just worked, and we'll meet towards the left-hand corner. So I'm finishing off a couple of more loops, and then I'm taking the leftover loops, and I'm going to save 2 loops for the tail. So I'm going to cut off anything extra, and then I'm going to cut those 2 loops open. And then I'm going to thread that tail with a yarn needle to help me weave it in. Now you just need to weave in the tail through the bind off loops at the top, and then just cut off any remaining yarn. Once that's done, we'll move to the bottom edge of our blanket. So we're at the bottom row, and unfortunately I had a camera issue, so it's a bit blurry. To make this edge a bit more polished, we need to set up the loops. So the first loop will go to the right of the V, which is the knit column. You're going to poke it through that hole there, front to back. Then the second loop, you're not going to touch, just leave it dangling. But the third one is also going to go to the right of that V, except this time it's going through the hole back to front. The fourth loop is left dangling, so don't touch it. The fifth loop goes to the right of that V, and it's going through that hole front to back. The sixth loop is left dangling, so we don't need to touch it. The seventh loop is going to go through that hole next to the V, and it's going through back to front. So now I'm pulling on the loops for the bind off a little bit, just to make it easier to start the bind off process. So again, it's just as we did with the top edge. We're going to insert one loop into the other, and we're just going to keep feeding through one another until we get to the other side. So let's have a look at the chain so far. So you'll notice that one loop was left behind. So I'm going to undo it a bit so we can include it. Okay, let's have a look at this chain. Okay, so we can see that it's coming along nicely and it's really facing the bottom of the blanket. It's not on the front or on the back. To get it to be balanced that way, that's why I had those loops sometimes being inserted front to back and then sometimes back to front. So I hope you like this nice bottom edge. It's something I had to experiment with many times since I'd never seen this type of edge be really on the bottom rather than facing you. So on your own, you can set up the loops in the same manner and you can bind off as you go. And we'll meet again in the right-hand corner to finally finish this blanket. So we're now within minutes of finishing this blanket, which feels great, especially since this is the longest knitting project I think I've ever worked on. So bind off to the end, stick the tail into the last loop, and then you'll weave in the tail with either your fingers or yarn needle. I chose to weave it up the side. Then afterwards, you can just cut off any remaining yarn with your scissors, and then you're all done with your rib stitch blanket. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, comment, or subscribe. Thanks for watching Ms. Yarn.